As a leader, your job is to make sure everybody's in the right seat, they have the playbook, and then your job is to harmonize, to make sure that they all know how to cooperate and collaborate together. That requires a lot of well thought out communication, which is a big part of what we miss. How do you bring people in with that, understand the core value or align with the core value, but how do you maintain that at a go forward basis? You continue with harmonizing, you continue communicating, you continue engaging teams to make sure that they are all continuing to be aligned.
Welcome to the Strategy at Scale podcast, brought to you by Scaling Up, Outthinker, and the Growth Institute. I'm your host, Kahin Krippendorf. Our mission is to cut through the noise of conflicting advice and get to what actually works. We speak to entrepreneurs and business builders who've led through complexity and uncertainty to extract high-impact strategies that drive real scalable growth. You just heard from Shirin Behzadi. She's an entrepreneur, board leader, and author of The Unexpected CEO. Her story is unlike any you've heard. She arrived in the US as a teenager, escaping post-revolutionary Iran, alone, broke, and rebuilding from scratch. Over the next 3 decades, she quietly built a career that would place her at the helm of one of the country's largest home service franchise platforms. But her path to the top wasn't a straight line. After working at firms like EY and serving as CFO of a bank, Shirin stepped into entrepreneurship with a fractional CFO practice that led her to a struggling window covering franchise. What started as a consulting role became a full turnaround. She helped reshape the culture, uncover the company's real strengths, and navigate a high-stakes private equity partnership, all while growing the business into a national platform, having a family, having children. She didn't just lead through uncertainty, she used it to build something bigger. As CEO, she scaled the business to nearly $1 billion in system-wide sales, expanding to over 12,000 cities, and led a successful 9-figure exit, all while raising a family, managing private equity dynamics, and recovering from a brain tumor that left her temporarily unable to walk or talk. In this episode, we cover what it looks like to turn personal adversity into the mindset and muscle needed to lead at scale, how to identify when your business is solving the wrong problem and pivot towards a more scalable core, what it takes to lead a real turnaround during a crisis, from resetting marketing to rebuilding trust, why storytelling isn't just for customers or investors, it's essential for staying aligned as a leader, how to navigate the moment when your team starts pulling in different directions and bring them back together. Whether you're leading through uncertainty or scaling with purpose, this conversation bridges the personal and practical, showing how lived experience can shape strategy, leadership, and long-term growth. Let's dive in with Shirin. Shirin, thank you so much for being on this podcast and for writing this book. It is great to have you here. I love the book. Often when I prepare for these podcasts, I will not really read the book, but study the book. And that was my intention to do with you. However, your story and the way that you articulate your story is so compelling. I had to read the whole thing. And I couldn't think of a sentence or a paragraph that I could skip. So you really did an excellent job. And this is your very first book, as I understand it.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you for your wonderful words. They mean the world to me.
It's just the truth. It's just the truth. The story, so your story is so compelling and it interweaves with the business story. However, we're going to do a little bit of that, but we're going to focus mostly on your business insights. But we really encourage readers to read the book, and there's going to be plenty of other content that people can find to hear about your extraordinary story. But just to kind of set the stage, could you let's just go over just a little bit of the arc of your narrative, right? You're born in Iran. You during the revolution, you leave, you go to Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
You're there by yourself as a teenager. And then how did you then find your way to the United States?
Yes, well, that's a good question. Thanks for having me. And to build on what you said about the book itself, I wrote it as a business memoir. So the idea was sharing stories and lessons learned along the way to help others build, accomplish, grow, and live their vision. So I wasn't telling stories for the sake of telling stories. It was to explain the principles that I learned that helped me later on grow companies. In that same sense, therefore, I did include stories of childhood and where I grew up, only to later on weave into how those experiences helped me later on. Having grown up in Iran and seeing the country pre-revolution, after the revolution, the sense of safety was gone because of all the chaos that happened. I was arrested a couple of times. I lived through the war. And eventually, my parents decided that in order for me to build a life, they thought the best thing for me to do is to leave. So at 17 years old, being the youngest of 5 children with lots of family, I packed everything I owned in a suitcase and left with no parents, no siblings, no friends, very little money. And I landed in Turkey because that was the place we could go. And I had very little money, didn't speak the language. So imagine a 17-year-old girl in an environment that wasn't that easy to navigate, finding her way through. How did that happen? And I've reflected on it. The idea of writing the book was to reflect and see where those moments are. At some point, I decided that I was going to reach for hope, that this was not going to defeat me, that I was going to find my way to the United States. So I did and I explained it in the book, but through a series of call it coincidences, I finally found admission to a college in the United States remotely.
Oh, you were still in Turkey and you were able to find admission to college. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Which at the time, Iranians, especially young Iranians, weren't given visas, but I did reach into, again, what's compelling to me, and let's make sure that I'm compelling to whoever interviewed me, and found my way, therefore, to the United States.
Tell us about that. Tell us about that visa, if you don't mind. You're in the U.S. Embassy in Turkey, and it's not clear. You're invited to come to study in the United States, but it's not clear that you're going to actually get the visa, and it's not likely.
No. Especially since, like I said, then young Iranian people were considered a threat. And I can understand that because there was a hostage crisis and all kinds of anti-American sentiments in Iran. So I can understand how there was doubt whether or not I would be the right fit. What I did, though, in advance of was to prepare myself. I asked myself this question: why do I want to do this? Why do I want to go to the United States? What am I pursuing? Once I achieved clarity around that, which was I had been opportunities in life had been taken away from me, right? To grow, to go to college, to build a life because of the circumstances. I wasn't going to have this upcoming opportunity, if it's given to me, go to waste. That I was going to be a productive citizen of my community between the work that I did, the contribution that I made. I had clarity that I was going to do it and do it well. And that's how I presented myself when I interviewed at the embassy. It took a while. There were doubts and a lot of questions. And eventually they were convinced because I was convinced. Isn't that a great lesson learned? Because fast forward years later, when you're interviewing and negotiating, let's say, with private equity or investors or buying and selling companies, those same principles apply. If you understand where you're coming from, what your mission is, what you want to do and bring to the table, the benefit that you want to bring to the table, now you open up doors to be able to negotiate with others.
I just want to add a few other things to that, if you don't mind. This is for listeners who think we're only talking about a personal odyssey here. What I saw, and I'm even reading more into this, is there is this pattern of recognizing there is a better opportunity. There is understanding the game, understanding who the players are, what they care about, whether those are customers or those are suppliers, knowing what you need to learn, and then having the confidence to go and learn it. And I see that repeat over and over in your story.
You're absolutely right. The idea is this: you tell the personal stories so that you can really explain the principles at work. One of them is your circumstance does not have to dictate your destiny. Even if that circumstance is, as an entrepreneur, you're growing the company, you're bump into a very difficult challenge, you're dealing with market forces. All of those factors are basically circumstances. So how do you get through and find your way through, not only through them, but grow from them? That's the idea of sharing personal stories. So when going back to the personal story, when I landed in the United States, I still didn't have parents. I didn't have a lot of money. I was displaced. I started working at a gas station. I was a gas station. I was a cashier at a bulletproof booth at a gas station, not a nice neighborhood. And even then, eventually, after a lot of licking my wounds and feeling sorry for myself, I did come up with this thought. I was going to someday run a big company. That's what mobilized me, which is if you really, if you reflect on it, you know that I actually printed business cards. Somebody who had zero money, right? No business printing business cards, but it gave me something tangible to look at and say, I am going to do this. It was that power of knowing that, of course, took decades to materialize, but it was what gravitated me towards where I ended up in life.
And so you're working at this gas station and you're also studying. What did you decide to study?
Well, I had started as a math major because I was good at math. And I thought, well, I can do software engineering or something like that. Since I had the vision of someday running a big company, I thought to myself, what's the language of business? Sounded like finance and accounting. So I switched majors to accounting, and the rest is history.
So then I know we're passing through a lot of very interesting history. This leads to this opportunity to do an internship at EY and then to actually joining EY. Why did you know that? I guess you already answered this probably, but why was EY the right place for you? And what did it take to get and perform well enough? Because it's not easy to get the internship.
I worked full time as a cashier at a gas station and really didn't make a lot of money. I still had very lofty goals. So when it was time for me to think about what I was going to do after I graduated, I thought, I'm going to shoot for the stars. I'm going to go for, back then, the big 8 accounting firms. Somewhere, somehow, I had learned that internships help. So I remember going to the career office and, I went to a state school. This was not very well known for its, business school, or wasn't really recruited heavily from the big 8 at the time. So I remember the career office, the lady told me, well, I don't want to disappoint you, so know that this is probably not going to happen. This is where I learned, or maybe re-emphasized the thought in my mind. You can hear people out, and probably you should hear people out. There are different points of view, but you don't have to listen to them. Because oftentimes when people tell you what you cannot do, it's coming from their own limitations. What a relevant story later on as an entrepreneur, because by definition, a lot of what you do is new. And so society, people, supposed experts tell you it's not possible, it's statistically difficult, all of those things. But so I decided I wasn't going to listen to her. I did submit my application and I got one of the 8 positions in the entire greater Los Angeles area with EY. Never heard of for someone from my school. And then when I graduated, I had offers from all of the big 8 accounting firms. I started with EY. I remember the first day of my start group, because accounting firms have once a year large start groups. Looking around the room as people introduced themselves, and I loved how they were all graduate. They had graduated really good schools, and they gave their backgrounds, and they were all well spoken. And I chuckled to myself, thinking, did you know I was working at a gas station not too long ago? So it was a great place to be. Fast forward years later, as you know in the book, I did a lot of good work with EY, including when we had our transactions.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes, you have a lot of transaction experience there, and you get exposed to a lot of businesses and industries. And I'm putting words in your mouth, but I would imagine you, from the perspective of the numbers, you can dissect different types of businesses and understand kind of like the inner workings of businesses. Yeah. So you then decide you're going to leave EY, you, as I remember, you decide that you're going to kind of just try out being a fractional CFO, or kind of you pull out your business cards again, and you come across this company, Home Franchise Concepts. Or was it called a Home Franchise Concept at the time, or called something else?
No,
Yes,
it
that's
wasn't.
right.
It was. So I left EY because I had stayed focused on my North Star of someday running a big company. Loved EY. It was very difficult for me to leave. But I realized that the more I stayed after a certain number of years, the more I would get good at auditing. But I wanted to understand operations. So I ended up joining one of our clients, and there I rose up to CFO of a good mortgage bank. And after we sold that bank is when I could have, there was a fork in the road. I asked myself, do I want to pursue becoming a CFO somewhere else, which made a lot of sense. I had been at EY, I had been a good CFO of a good sized company by then. And considering my financial insecurity, the way I had grown up, you would think that would have been the right choice. But I chose to go out on my own and be a fractional CFO, which was really building my own business in a lot of ways. Did that for a while, and that's when I came across a company that was called Budget Blinds. Once we grew Budget Blinds and added another brand, and we created the Home Franchise Concept, I think in 2006 or
And
something
what
like
did what
that.
did Budget Blinds do, and what was it that you saw in the company that made you think I might want to commit myself to this company?
Custom window coverings and custom window coverings with a franchising format. When I first met the company, it had been around for a while. It was definitely a very nice place. It was a nice company. It was still small. What happened was that as we started talking about plans and how to grow the company, it became apparent that it was a very smooth partnership between me and the guys that were already there. Like we bonded in the sense that we understood each other, and we would have conversations and discussions about how to grow. And that showcased to me how I can contribute. And I thought together we can grow this because I brought in with me the operation and financial expertise that at the time the company needed. So we were joined at the hip and we grew. We went down this entrepreneur journey. The first few years was challenging because it always is. It takes time to grow until we landed on what I call the secret sauce. And it was a few years later, of course. And then a year after that, we decided that we were going to try to expand to yet another brand and create Home Franchise
So
Concept.
I want to zoom in on that decision a little bit. I'm seeing this pattern with many of these interviews. For example, there's one person that we interviewed, and he had a software company, and it was doing really well. It was a CRM for a particular industry, for pharmaceuticals. And they had this choice. Now that we've kind of reached the potential that we think we can fairly reach here, we want to now grow. And do we do CRM in other places, or do we do something other than CRM in the industry? So it's like this question of what business are we really in? And so you're good at window coverings. You seem to be good at franchising, and like depending on which one you choose will determine the future. So what did you decide, and how did you decide it? Because I have one more thing is that, and I've said this many times on the podcast as well. Peter Drucker says strategy is the answer to the question, what business are you really in? And that's never easy to answer that question.
Excellent point. Excellent question. And one I have posed since I stepped down as CEO. We sold the company in 2019. I have helped others and advised other CEOs and boards and such. And I ask that same question because oftentimes you think of growth and you're not exactly sure what growth needs to look like for you as a company. We'd asked the same question. We had grown, pretty well. And then we sat back and said, well, what are we good at? What do we want to do? Do we go deeper? Do we become manufacturers? That's one direction. Mhm. Or do we consider going into other businesses that are not necessarily franchising? Do we get into storefronts? Where do we go? We took the time. We took the time to talk it through and think it through. more of what we focused on was, what is our competency? What are we good at? What do we think we bring to the table? Is it the product itself, or is it the process, systems, support that we provide, and training, of course, we provide our franchisees? And it was the latter that we thought we excelled at. Similarly, since then, I've talked to companies that had branched off with their offering only to find out that they had veered off from their core. Identifying your core, what are you good at, what your mission is critical in finding your path to the next phase of growth.
So I think it's around 1990 that Gary Hamel introduced or popularized this idea of core competency. And so if we're talking about that, I can see it not being so easy to know what your core competency is, because so many companies define themselves by their industry. And so that's the natural core competency. And so you kind of have to, I think, like take off this veil of what you think you are in order to actually look at these core competencies. What advice do you have, or how do you help leadership teams identify what those competencies are?
This became even more relevant, and I'm going to tell a little bit of a background here because it's going to be more digestible for this particular topic. I set out to bring in private equity in 2013. By the time 2015 turned around, we had found the right partners. It took that long to really try to figure out who's the right partner, because we didn't need the money. We wanted to bring in partnership because so many of us wanted to sell and move on, right? The company had made it was of size and it made sense. After we brought in private equity, one of the conditions was that I had to stay on and run the company to the expectations that we had set forth in our SIM, that what they wanted to see. But everybody else was bought out. So before you knew it, we were a sizable company, but I was the CEO, CIO, CFO, CMO, and COO, all of them. And it was a franchise system, and we had private equity expectations. You would think that the first thing I would do is to focus on generating revenues, filling those positions, making sure the bottom line stays intact. Of course, those were concerns, and of course, I stayed on top of them. But really, what the first thing that I did was, let's redefine ourselves. What you find is that a company, especially when you are an entrepreneur and you've been at it for years, you kind of lose sight of that core. Is it core competency, core values? You do. Naturally, you grow and evolve, and people's expectations and where they think the competencies are diverge. So the idea was, let's go around and do a listening tour. Let's go find out from the people in the front lines, where I'm not just talking about executives, of course, include executives, but also various teams. And then have a listening tour in the sense of talking to them about, who are we? Where do you think we're going to go? And what are, in the way of core, who are we? Let's talk about our core values, not just who are we in what we provide to the world. Then as we went through that, we learned a few things. One, there were definitely gaps. And we expand that, by the way, that listening tour to include our partners, to eventually, of course, our franchises, and eventually our customers. So we had a lot of stakeholders that we brought into this. What we learned, there were gaps, and these gaps existed clearly because people had come in at different times of the lifespan of the company, and their impression and expression of who we were and what we were doing were varied. We also, and those
because
gaps
because when they came in, you were a different kind of company or something like that. Yeah. Gotcha.
Yes. Or they came in 2 years later, or they came in 5 years later. Like, we had been around for a while. That's where the gaps were. And some of those gaps made a lot of sense because we had never really, for instance, our suppliers really didn't know who we were because we hadn't brought them into the fold. We hadn't brought them into the discussion. Where the commonalities existed, where I thought it was a foundation based on which we can build and grow together. Through that exercise, a few things happened. One, we learned where areas of opportunity existed, like low-hanging fruits, things that you would think I would know, having been there for so many years. No, people in the front lines oftentimes know better where opportunities exist. So immediately put those to work. Also, by engaging teams and people and hearing them out, you engage them. When you engage people, you get their critical thinking working. You get them participating in what the company is doing. That's part of a big challenge right now in the marketplace with low engagement. And I always say, if you want your employees to be engaged, you have to engage them. So that was the second benefit. And the third benefit, it created clarity as to who we were. We realized that we really had to redefine our brands. So brands that had been around for years, we completely redid our brand bios. We changed the voice, the look and feel, but also their essence and go to market. For all of that, we created a vision, which was to create a platform of brands that work synergistically together. And now that because we had included everybody in the conversation and communicated back very effectively all the time, I believe those are the reasons why a company that had been around for a while, at one size, we better than doubled that size in 4 years. We grew our franchisees system-wide sales by 70% in an industry that only grows by single digit. And we were already sizable. Those are the reasons. So it's a long way of answering your question. Figuring out core competency, core values, who you are not easy. It's an exercise that you can't dictate from the top down. It's an exercise you champion from the top down, but you have to include conversations that include other people.
At this point, you're this multi-brand franchise. But before we get there, I just want to go back to before you decided to expand outside of window coverings, because you have the choice of just vertically integrating into window coverings, but instead you said, what we really are is a really good franchising company, maybe within certain kind of space. And then you decided, you correct me if I'm wrong here, then you started looking at what other types of franchise could we expand into. So talk to us about that. How did you go through the search, having decided we're a franchise company, not a windows covering company? How did you go through the search of deciding what that next franchise opportunity should be?
We thought we were a franchise company because we thought our passion every way we went about was supporting people to own their own businesses. And we were good at that.
Right.
And so from there, we thought, we know home. Our franchisees went through a consultative process. They went into a customer's home and they sat with them, designed with them in mind, because it was custom. So we thought, rather than reinvent or get into a line of business, even in franchising, the product offering that's not consistent with who we are, what else can this model work for? Meaning, if a franchisee goes into a customer's home, we can train them how to do that. We can support them how to do that. We've trained them how to work with homeowners to design with them in mind. What other kinds of products can they do that with? So staying in our lane is more what we agreed to. And it had come up naturally over and over again from our franchisees that, listen, when we go to people's homes, we see people doing all kinds of work with their home organization, closets and such, like California closets concept in the world. And so how about we do that? So like everything else we've done since, we thought it was a good idea. It made sense because it is kind of similar in the sense people go in, measure and order the product and come back and install. So in those ways, it was consistent with custom window coverings. But of course, we thought we're going to pilot it first. So we did bring in some folks that know the space really well. One of them you and I talked about earlier, and really pick their brain about market size.
Brian Scudamore of California Closets.
Yes.
Who is also on this podcast. Yep.
Yeah. Know him well. Great guy, but at a lower price point, because I thought we're more like your average, middle income. And so we piloted it. We tested our marketing with a couple of our franchisees. We tested to see if we can train them. We asked a few people to come on board, franchisees to come on board and work with us in fleshing out what that concept would look like before we rolled it out. And then we rolled it out in phases. The phase one was, we called it friends and family and franchises. So our existing friends and family and franchises were able to sign up for our new franchise system, but only them at a lower price, because that way we could really figure out the kinks and see if this is really the right direction to go into.
You also looked at the external market, it looked like. I mean, you looked at your total addressable market, you look at the competition. And it goes, what would be your suggestion for an entrepreneur that's at this phase? Like, you got the core business and then you're thinking about what your horizon 2 will be. And are there any kind of key checklist things, or in addition to the capabilities? I understand the capabilities and talking to your franchisees and seeing if they would have the skills, capabilities in order to be able to expand into this, because you're expanding now through your existing franchise, because that is kind of an installed base or a loyal kind of channel that you can give you that kind of advantage. But what else, when you're advising entrepreneurs, should be on the checklist that maybe entrepreneurs sometimes forget?
Absolutely get to know your white space. What are we looking at? What is the potential? What is the market currently looking like? Where is it projected to go? I spent hours talking to people that were in the know in this particular space to really understand it. What are the dynamics at play? What are we thinking about growth? Where is the future of the particular industry, and how would we fit in with it? And then do performance. Now, I know, what does they say? Planning is essential. Plans are obsolete. So, like, you put it on paper, and before you put it on paper, it's no longer useful, but it anchors you to understanding what are the parameters, what are the factors that you need to take into account, which levers can you pull in the process to generate the kind of growth and revenues you have in mind. So really become a student of the space, and become a student of the space as if you're operating in it. Literally do performance. In our case, because we're franchisees, I also franchise system. I also did similarly for a single take a model franchise and say, what would it look like for them?
Got it. I love it. There's so much more we can go into, but I hear that also many times on this podcast, is getting on the ground, getting out of your office, getting in front of customers and partners and franchisees, and like you have to firsthand touching and experiencing. You use a word. I don't know if there's something here. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. In this section of the book, you used that you have to craft a compelling business story. And I was wondering what you meant before the new concept. I'm just kind of what you mean. I'm thinking a compelling business story is the branding narrative, or is it the logic narrative of why we would expand into here? Is it the narrative for employees and franchises? Is it valid for you making a informed decision? What did you mean by compelling business story?
You're very good with this observation, because this is one thing I, to this day, when I work with others, encourage them to do. Tell me what you're doing in a short, not multi-paragraph. I'm not talking about a book. Just tell me what you're doing in your words. If you can do that, the shorter you can make it, the more it tells me you know what you're doing. So similarly, when in our case, and these are, by the way, lessons that have been learned along the way, right? Through trials and errors and lived experiences. So I feel like it's like laws of gravity. They just exist. You just bump into them, learn them. The idea is this: if you don't have clarity who you are and why people would buy from you, whatever it is that you have to sell, whether it's customers or clients, then they won't either. If you will know what it is that you are, who you are, and why they should love your product, let's say if it's a product, then your customers will never hear it. So start there.
Right. I love that. Yeah, we had someone on our podcast, a storytelling expert. She kind of, I mean, this is the kind of thing which you hear it and you're like, yes, of course. But in the heat of it, it's not immediately coming out. But the clarity of your story allows it to propagate, and it shows that your logic is clean.
That process of coming up with that clean logic is such an educational process. Because you'd be surprised how challenged you are to put things in that format because you go, whoa, what do I really know?
I have so many questions, and we won't have time to go through all of the questions. So I'm just going to jump forward a little bit. It's now, I think, 2008. There's a great recession. I love this quote. I'm not going to get exactly right, from Warren Buffett, which is, when the tide recedes, you can see who's swimming without their swim trunks. And the tide recedes, suddenly people don't have, they lose that second job. They are under pressure with their mortgage. It's very difficult for them to think about investing in their home. And so you put together this really interesting turnaround. So you could walk through it a little bit. I'll just kind of lay out the key things I saw, which it was just, one is, you realize we shouldn't be marketing to everyone. We have to pinpoint the customers that are resilient and that are still investing, which means we have to change our marketing strategy from branding to like direct. And then that has redefining our identity and the rest. Just walk us through what was like, what happened. How did you get over that fear and get your team over that fear? And what was the first insight that had you find a way out? Because I think it's a really clever, it is a textbook on a turnaround strategy.
Well, thank you. The Great Recession, if you recall, was housing led. It was foreclosures up and down the street. Can you imagine? We were in the world of home improvement. By then, we had two brands that were, the second one was relatively new. So it felt like the bottom fell out. We started losing franchises, not at any fault of our own, because people were just, one, not buying home improvement, anything home related. People didn't have disposable income or were fearful. And also our franchisees were dealing with the same financial circumstances as anybody else. So they had their own issues to deal with. You asked about fear, which is very, very important to note. Yes, I want to say maybe I was in the fetal position a couple of times. It is not fear. Fear is true. But it's also, fear is my friend. It's okay to be fearful. It's okay to say, this is not an easy situation. How do we view it? So given the little bit of time to lick my wounds, then I said, and now what? So the first thing we did was to say, what is the absolute bottom? Like, how low do we have to go before we're out of business? So to understand what our runway was. Any business can do that. Like, how much cash do we have?
So you built like a spreadsheet, right? A simple spreadsheet, right? And I just want to pull something out on that as well. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you here, but what I think it's also an important point that keeps resonating with me is the courage to like look at the facts and look beyond the emotion and not be too scared to say, oh, I don't want to do that spreadsheet because I'm afraid of what it will. But if when you looked at it, so to tell us about.
That's very difficult to do, and it's very scary to do, but you have to be realistic. Okay, what would the world look like if this trend continues? So that showcased how much of a runway we had. And then we said, okay, now what do? We have an obligation to our franchisees and of course to our stakeholders. How do we make sure we survive this? Well, in a world that people aren't really doing home improvements, how do we sell home improvement products? Let's think about this. Are there still customers buying? And one thing I want to point out is, in every environment, every market, including the Great Depression, people bought things. So there are customers out there. The challenge was, who are they? Why would they be doing this? And how do we reach them? So to answer those three questions, we set out to work and we changed everything. To your point, we thought, well, these are mostly customers that may not be looking at larger projects. Larger projects are probably not going to be where it's at. Smaller projects to allow people to remodel their homes. Americans change their homes every 4 to 7 years. Well, it was frozen at the time. This was not going to happen. So we thought, well, they can still change the look and feel of their home by making some smaller changes, smaller investments. So how do we appeal to that market? We therefore designed our products and product offerings to do that. We similarly changed our marketing messaging to really focus on all of that. And we added on one more layer. When people are out of work, which a lot of people were, they would want to go out on their own. So we upped the marketing and messaging around our franchising. So come in and buy a franchise and we'll put you into business. We also did all kinds of other things, working with our franchisees, payment plan programs, all of that. To me, the main reason why we were able to do that well, and the main reason that we continue to grow beyond, was, to me, we had to make sure that we knew who we were serving. And I believe that our job was to making sure franchisees thrive. So if franchisees thrive, we would benefit from it. So that's why we managed all of the ways we supported them, changed it all. What happened as a result, Kaihan, was that we became really, really good at what we did, much better than we were before. Exactly what Warren Buffett said. The pie of customers had shrunk rapidly. But because we got really good at what we did, our portion of that pie grew. Others went out of business. We stayed in business. So as we found our way out of that Great Recession, we now had a bigger piece of a pie that continued to grow. And that's where our trajectory was.
And there is, as in my reading of it, there is now also a capability that you need to develop, and you got good at developing, which is this direct marketing as opposed to overall brand marketing. Can you just walk us through that?
Yes. So we had all along thought our job was to make sure that our franchisees are known in their areas. When the Great Recession came about, we thought what we need to be completely focused on, call it make the phones ring. Of course, they're not all phones, but we thought this is what we need to do. So every way we talk, every way we market it, we have to make sure that that funnel is direct response, that we get people to take action. How do we do that? Do we do it through offerings? Do we do it through discounts? Do we do it through messaging? That became our plan. Later on, as we found our way out of the recession and we had bigger budgets, we of course put more of that into branding as well. But at the time, that was what we really focused on. I want to fast forward during our years where we grew significantly, which is what I call CEO years in the last third of the book. One of the main reasons we grew very fast was that we got even better at all things marketing, including local marketing, and how to get franchisees better at doing their own marketing as well as we did nationally.
And that also helps you, as I recall, with your suppliers now, right? Because you've got a bigger piece of the smaller pie, and you become an even more important sales channel for them, and you can prove to them that you have this unique capability that is right for this new strategy.
Yes, that's a very good point. We got even more transparent and more ambitious with our suppliers, making a case to them. Hey, work with us, come up with programs, plans, pricing, warranties that are unique, because we promise you we're going to sell your product better than anybody else because we can train and promote and market it.
Are there changes that you made? So the narrative that I'm laying out here is change in the market. We have to shift our strategic focus to this particular segment. That requires to build this new capability. It allows us to now renegotiate with suppliers. So you're kind of like realigning the company around the new reality. Is there anything that you did, and I don't think you said you wrote this book, so the answer might be no, anything that you changed around your people or your org structure or something like that?
Not so much post the Great Recession, but when we're talking about the next really big phase of growth, which is later on, absolutely. I want to say culture is so important. It's so significant in making sure that an organization is aligned appropriately. And that is a big challenge.
What is culture to you? Is it values? Is it patterns of behavior? Is it, I don't know, mindsets? Or what is culture for you?
Probably all of the above. I want to say that if you were to really, really zoom in and focus it on a couple of points, I would say it's mostly core values. The idea of having very clear core values is that then you can invite people in to join that fit those core values so they're consistent. And folks that don't, it won't belong to the organization.
Mhm. Any tips that you have for managing core values? So I can see you could have core values, and at Outthinker, we have these core values for our members, and we'll say our members are our clients, and we say, "Are you smart enough to be humble? If you're a lifelong learner, if you're future oriented, that speaks to you, and you can use that at the kind of the intake side. But any tips for how to maintain those core values after someone is hired?
I think it comes down to very strong leadership. And leadership is defined by in many ways. The way I see leadership, I always liken it to an orchestra conductor. Your job is to make sure that everybody's seated in the right seats. So that's job one, because oftentimes that people are not in the right positions, the right seats. So that's as if you have someone, to use the same analogy, who knows how to play the violin, have them sit at the piano. It doesn't necessarily work. So that's one. You also want to make sure that everybody has their own playbook, that their ability to know what's expected of them, which oftentimes makes sense for them to also participate in creating. But as a leader, your job is to make sure everybody's in the right seat, they have the playbook, and then your job is to harmonize, to make sure that they all know how to cooperate and collaborate together. That requires a lot of well thought out communication, which is a big part of what we miss. And so, how do you bring people in with that, understand the core value or align with the core value, but how do you maintain that at a go forward basis? You continue with harmonizing, you continue communicating, you continue engaging teams to make sure that they are all continuing to be aligned.
Okay, excellent. And then came even greater scaling, and unfortunately, we're gonna kind of fast forward through a lot of that. But you laid the foundations for what became even a bigger business, and then you have this chapter in the book, and I think it's called like cracks in the team. You start seeing these cracks in the team emerge, and it kind of leads you to realizing that it was time to look at selling. If you could talk us through that, and then I'm going to ask you about capital allocation.
It happens in entrepreneurial companies where you start in a common place and everybody has more or less it's the same understanding of where the company is going to go. But things change, people's lives change, circumstances change, and as you grow a company, also interactions over time result in maybe people not ending up in the same place, in their mindset. So I say that oftentimes companies grow past experience, expertise, know-how, or the desire of its owners. We had inconsistencies across management with commitment, what everybody wanted to do next. And it had created an environment where growth was at risk. There's no such thing as staying the same. You're either moving backwards or you're going forwards. And the forward momentum was difficult to accomplish when we had people that were not necessarily on the same page. So it was a collaborative decision. It was something we all sat down and said, okay, is this time now to help us perhaps take some dollars off the table and exit? And the consensus was, if we can land on a number, and we wrote the number on the board, if this is the number, we're all happy to move on. With that, I set out to find the right partners.
And then how do you in general make that decision? Because I'm reading this into your story. You come from math, from finance, from accounting. You start looking at companies from the numbers. You make these rational decisions. And what I'm hearing over and over in interviews is this capital allocation piece is really key to creating value and creating a sustainable company. And here some of the capital allocation decisions are: do we reinvest in the core? Do we invest into new? Do we take money out and distribute it? Do we buy back shares? Do we sell?
Very good question. You've got to know why you're raising capital, right? In our case, our main objective was to allow people that wanted to leave. So that was the reason. Once we made that decision, then we could model what dollars would look like and what would we do with the dollars and what would future look like if we had infusion of capital that would help us grow. What would that growth look like? So it was first solving for why we're doing this and then turning it into a model. One thing I do want to add that may sound anti-intuitive, but it's true. Even though my background is finance and accounting, and I've done a lot of financial management, a lot of very good decisions are, call it gut based. But it's not, but gut, I think it's a limited word, maybe. It's really putting all the factors together, meaning not just the financial, but also, is this a good fit? Is this a good culture? Is this going to help? There are other factors that are just as significant that come into
Yeah,
play.
yeah, it makes sense. I think that a lot of the great decisions, maybe they're explainable afterwards, but at the time, you can't really explain with clear logic. So, we're at the top of our time with you, unfortunately, and I have so many other questions I'd love to pick your brain on. But what is there anything that you want to leave us with that we didn't get to cover?
Well, first of all, I think one thing I promote is that I'm passionate about letting people know that you can accomplish, live, grow, and build what you want because you can. I ended up where I ended up because I thought I could. And secondly, adversity is your superpower. Use adversity for your growth. That's what I'm doing today, is with my speaking and with my book and with the advice I give others.
That's awesome. And you can see that over and over in your life, that it was almost like out of one frying pan into another thing. It's and you just jump. That's amazing. Well, Shirin, thank you so much for sharing your journey with us here, sharing it in your book, and pulling it together in such both a practical but also engaging way. How can people continue to learn from you and follow you?
Thank you. Thanks for asking. The book is called The Unexpected CEO. So if they put that in, they can land on all of the information about me. My website is shirinbehzadi.com. Good luck spelling that. They can also connect with me with all kinds of social media. I do a lot of advice and posting, and it's all under my name.
Awesome. Well, Shirin, thank you so much for being here and making all this available to us. Thank you.
Thank you for what you do.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Strategy at Scale. A big thank you to our guest, Shirin Behzadi, our producer, Oscar Perez, and our teams at Scaling Up Outthinker and the Growth Institute. This episode also marks the end of our production collaboration with Growth Institute. We want to express our deep appreciation for their partnership and support in helping us bring these conversations to life. It has been an incredible journey, and we're grateful for everything we've built together. If you've enjoyed this series, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm Kaihan Krippendorf, and we'll catch you soon with more stories, more strategy, and more insights on Strategy at Scale.